Hello and welcome to the big picture. The last week's visit of US Deputy Secretary of State William Burns to India has brought out the serious concerns about Iran in the international community. For the first time, a senior US official has gone on record requesting India to persuade Iran to return to the negotiating table on its nuclear program. There have also been reports about a possible direct dialogue between the US and Iran on the issue after the US presidential elections, which, however, have been denied by both countries. Obviously, the issue is too sensitive concerning the fact that US is on an election mode. However, what the two presidential candidates will say on Iran during the last round of debate scheduled for tomorrow morning will be watched closely. Meanwhile, now that the US has openly asked India to mediate with Iran, the question is, should India take up the role of a mediator? What are the possible pitfalls and gains if India decides to do it? How will it impact on the relations between India and Iran on the one hand and the international community on the other? What does America's request to India mean in the larger context of India's role in international affairs? We will discuss all this today with Mr. Shashank, former Indian Foreign Secretary, Prof.A.K.Pasha, Director Gulf Studies Program in the JNU, C.Uday Bhaskar, former Director Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis and Senior Fellow, National Maritime Foundation. We will be joined soon by other guests. Welcome to all of you. Let me first go to Mr. Shashank. Mr. Shashank, is this the first time US has openly asked India to, play a role of a mediator as far as Iran is concerned? And if it is so, why? And what does it mean?
Well, Israel has been putting a lot of pressure on USA to set certain red lines and then to move ahead, so take action.
Right.
Whereas USA has been trying to find whether through negotiations, through persuasion, some way can be found to avoid a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran.
Right.
And it is perhaps in that context that USA is trying to explore all the neighbors of Iran, including India, whether they can also persuade Iran to move ahead and to see that a direct action is not faced by the international community. Of course, we know that the Americans are having their elections shortly, and therefore Iran perhaps is not very keen as yet. Now, in this context, whether P5+1, who are already negotiating, acting as a kind of intermediary, etc., whether it's necessary to have others.
Exactly.
And these are issues which need to be sorted out. But the point is that mediation is necessary only when the parties cannot talk to each other,
right,
and they are willing to have a mediator.
Right.
Here we do not know. Only a request has been made that India should also persuade Iran.
Right.
Which may be also in a very polite manner to tell India that you please make sure that you do not make any direct contact with Iran to continue in your trade relations or energy security kind of a concept, or building infrastructural linkages to Central Asia, etc. with Iran. First of all, you have to put on the table the idea about the nuclear power program or nuclear program of Iran.
Right. So you think there may also be a veiled threat in this offer? Or request, rather?
Well, the point is that Americans are a bit confused because Indians have not come forward very clearly as to what are their own minimum position which they will not budge from. So energy security being one, infrastructure linkages with these other countries in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, etc. There are all kinds of things which have, from time to time, they have been talked, but not in an authoritative manner. So it's very important that, like Israel has been putting across its viewpoint, India should put across its viewpoint with regard to relations with Iran and what kind of a neighborhood do we like to see?
Exactly.
Do we want to see everybody Pak Afghanistan kind of region to develop elsewhere also? Or do we want a different kind of a scenario? And I'm quite sure that even during the election campaign, whereas the focus is on China, but it is very important that India puts across clearly its position with regard to the neighborhood.
Okay. Professor Pasha? How do you read the situation? Do you think that the US is trying to use India, or do you think it thinks that India is probably one of the players who can actually persuade Iran?
I think both. In the sense, now increasingly the Americans have been talking about Indian interest at stake
Right.
in the Gulf region. They know that for almost 7 years they have been trying to persuade India to cut drastically our relations with
Right.
Iran, and it hasn't worked.
It doesn't work. And it's
Now
very,
they feel they have reached a position
it's
where
very interesting that just today we have a report just sometime back. The Petroleum Minister, Mr. Jaipal Reddy, is in Dubai, and there he has made a mention of this, and he says that U.S. understands that India needs Iran for its oil.
Yeah, that is crucial. That
Yes.
apart,
Ah.
we also have made the Americans very clear that once the NATO troops withdraw from Afghanistan, Iran is the durable link for our continued sustained interaction
Right.
in Afghanistan.
Right.
And for that, the land route from Chabahar has to be expanded. That is being done. But more importantly, the Iranians have made specifically 2 points. And that is, if there is an attack, if and when it takes place on its nuclear facilities, they're going to retaliate on Bahrain and Qatar,
Okay.
where the Fifth Fleet of America has its headquarters,
Right.
and the Central Command is located. And these 2 also host large number of Indians.
Right.
And they have also not ruled out Kuwait, because
Right.
about 25,000 troops remain there. That could also be targeted, or it could be affected by Bushehr nuclear plant from the radiation fallout. So increasingly they are alerting India that if the situation goes out of hand, Indian interest also would be involved, other than oil, which we import from Iran despite American exhortation. So in that way, they know that Indian interests are involved. India has close relations. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was there for NAM summit, and he had fairly good talks with the Ali Khamenei,
Yes.
supreme leader, and also with Ahmadinejad, in spite of all the efforts to isolate India and Iran.
And Iran.
So they know that India also has close relations with Israel.
Right.
And we are in a position to find out exactly what the Iranians have in mind as far as the nuclear aspects are concerned, whether additional protocols could be acceptable to the Iranian regime, other than what they have divulged to the P5+1,
Yes.
where 2 rounds of talks
Talks
have
of
been
the
held.
held. Okay. Let me get Uday Bhaskar in. Uday Bhaskar, is it in the interest of India to accept this request of the US and go ahead and try to mediate with Iran?
Well, Girish, I would look at this at 2 levels. One is the overture or the reference
Right.
that the United States has encouraged India
Right.
to, the word being used is mediate as far as Iran is concerned.
Right.
Now, I would suggest that this in itself is a positive development and a reflection of what I would call as the overall improvement and the content in the India-US relationship. So that is one aspect.
Right.
The second is, how effective will India be? And related to that is your question about, is it desirable for India
Right.
to, in a way, get involved in this? Now here my own response is that India's effectiveness would at this point be limited. And the reason I say this is that this particular issue has been an old chestnut. It's a very nettlesome issue. It has been debated in the UN Security Council many times.
Yes.
And as of now, there is a polarization where the United States and its European allies, and to an extent Japan, are on one side on the Iranian issue. And we see that Russia and China have taken what might be described as a different position.
Right.
So the fact that India is now being encouraged by the United States is something that we in India should also, I think, look at as what I would call as a positive development, that the United States is engaging with India on Iran, because till recently, you'll remember, there were 2 no-go areas. India
Right.
and the United States had very divergent perceptions on Pakistan and on Iran.
Absolutely.
And conceptually, they are the same problem. A state that acquires nuclear weapons and that is seen to be supporting terrorism is the issue that concerns both Washington and Delhi.
Right.
For Delhi, it is Pakistan. For Washington, it is Iran.
Right.
So to that extent, I would say that this is something that we should proceed cautiously. But whether we will be effective is something which is a bit of a question mark, because I think, as the other 2 panelists, Professor Pasha and Mr. Shashank, have pointed out, India has abiding interests. There is Afghanistan after 2014, where
Right.
Iran's role cannot be discounted. There is the energy dimension, India-Iran, and the whole West Asian sort of matrix, where there is a very complex tension going on between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and now Turkey has entered the fray. So therefore, I think India should ruthlessly and objectively pursue its own national interest and see to what degree it would be able to enable a modus vivendi. So if India enters this, it would not be on US behalf. It will be for Indian interests and to ensure that we have some kind of a modus vivendi on many complex issues. That's the way I would frame this particular overture.
Uday Bhaskar, Mr. Shashank made a very interesting observation. He said this might even be some kind of a veiled threat to India as far as its relations with Iran is concerned. Do you also see it in the same manner?
I don't think so, because I believe personally that India-US relations now have reached a point where if the United States indeed wanted to convey something to India that would be, in your phrase, veiled threat, they wouldn't use the public platform. My sense is it would be conveyed in the appropriate, the comfort level today at the highest diplomatic levels between the Indian Foreign Ministry and their counterparts is, I think, more robust than it was in the past.
Then why do
So I imagine that it is not prudent for the US to issue a veiled threat in this manner.
But why do you think that they have made such a public offer or request to India? It's quite unusual. It has not been done in the past for them to come out so publicly and make this offer. What do you think was the intention of the US behind this public offer?
I really think that my reading is that they are encouraging India to perhaps get more involved and play a role. After all, India's been saying this for a long time, that we want to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
Right.
In the event you do become a permanent member, then you have to engage on very complex and contentious issues. Now, to me, I could read this as saying that even before you enter, just as they have the P5+1, where
Right.
Germany has been given a certain space and place,
Yeah.
that India is also being recognized to see if we can bring anything to the table. And let me add here that India has a certain distinctive relationship with Iran. So to that extent, I believe that in the event India were to engage on this issue, that it would not be a totally wasted effort. But I come back to the central point: how does India define its own national interest? Because we have taken a public position on Iran and its nuclear program that the emergence of another nuclear weapon power would not be desirable. So to that extent, India has stated its position.
Okay. Mr. Shashank, what is India's national interest? As Uday Bhaskar puts it, we have to go by our own national interest in all these complexities which is involved in this kind of a effort even to mediate.
No, first of all, we have to maintain peace in the region.
Right.
So as Dr. Pasha has said, that we have such a large Indian community living in this area,
Absolutely.
that we cannot afford to have any confrontation, any conflagration in the region. Number two, because after 2014, the American troops will be moving out, already there will be a tremendous amount of uncertainty whether the Afghan forces would be able to contain the radical elements and what kind of regional equation will emerge. What will be India's position in that kind of regional equation, and Iran's role also. If Iran plays a positive role, then it's quite likely that the Americans might see Iran in a slightly nuanced light, which they are already trying to see.
Right.
That's not like the Israelis who say that, okay, there are certain red lines and Iran has to be, whether all of them get united as a very nationalistic platform.
Yeah.
They're not bothered about that. The Americans are concerned about that aspect, that they have many friends in Iran. They have many liberals in Iran, so they don't want them to be totally alienated. So therefore, the idea is that perhaps we need to build the dialogue. And it is the dialogue process where India also comes in, because India has very large old links with Iran. There are differences from time to time. We have our own feelings that maybe they have not been very forthcoming on Kashmir issue. They have been advising us on the nuclear thing in a manner which we did not like.
Right.
But at the same time, we also know that they have been old friends and they are quite willing to help in our energy security, and giving Shahbar as a major link to Afghanistan, to Central Asia, etc. So these are important things. On Afghanistan, we were all together at one time.
Right. Okay. Anyway, 13% of India's oil requirements come from Iran, and which itself is one of the most major issue. Anyway, we'll go into a short break now. We'll come back and continue this discussion. Please keep watching. Be back very soon. Welcome back. We are discussing the Iran, the offer of US, rather the request of US to India to mediate with Iran on its nuclear program. We are also joined by Pramit Chaudhuri, foreign editor, Hindustan Times. Pramit, we have been discussing about this offer, which has been rather request which has been made by the US to India, and see, I want to know from you, if India decides to become a mediator and sits down with Iran and tries to persuade it to come to the negotiating table on its nuclear program, how will Israel look at India, and how will it affect the India-Israel relations?
I don't think it'll have any impact whatsoever, because Israel has used us to send messages to Iran in the past. I can remember once myself meeting a senior Israeli diplomat saying that we would like India to pass on a message, this was about 3 years ago, to Iran, that Israel has no fight with Iran, and that we do not understand why Iran is making these blood-curdling threats about Israel, but we have no particular interest in getting into a fight with them. And they were essentially using India as a medium of communication. So I think they would be perfectly fine with the idea of us playing the role on behalf of the United States or between the United States and Iran. The goal ultimately, we would just be acting as a messenger. We would not be, the point of a mediator is not to dictate terms to either side.
Okay, Prof.A.K.Pasha, do you subscribe to what Pramit says, that Israel should not have a problem, and their what he's saying, that Israel should not have a problem if India mediates with Iran?
Well, Israel expects a positive outcome from this Indian mediation. In the sense, from the very beginning, they have set on one goal, that under no circumstances Israel is going to allow nuclear weapon capability of the mullah-led regime in Tehran. So they would expect India to send home this message that Iranian nuclear program has to be dismantled and no dream of acquiring nuclear weapons.
And do you think India would be able to persuade Iran to do that?
No, we are not in a position to persuade. We may only convey to the...
So we can only be messengers?
Yes, not more than that, because the Iranians would not like interference. But the only thing is we can only postpone the idea of an attack which the Israelis have been talking so very vehemently.
Right.
Of course, Barack Obama has been able to postpone until the elections. But if Romney were to be elected, he has put the January deadline, Netanyahu, if he gets re-elected in the 22nd January re-election. So in that way, at best, we are buying time and then trying to use India to ward off the imminent threat. But substantive talks will have to be with the Russians, the Chinese, the P5+1, and directly with the Americans, whoever occupies the White House.
Uday, Bhaskar, should India play just the role of a messenger and get into this mess? And if it is not able to, Prof.A.K.Pasha feels that India is not in a position to persuade Iran to give up its nuclear program. First of all, the big question, whether Iran is capable, has a capable nuclear weapons program itself is under question. But do you think India should just play the role of a messenger?
No, I think, Girish, to come back to what I was saying earlier, The point I said is that India has to define as to on what terms it is going to get engaged with
Right.
the Iranian issue. As of now, at the global level, this is being debated or discussed under the aegis of the UNSC, the Security Council,
Right.
where India has no particular locus, because even when it is there as a non-permanent member.
Right.
Now, the word mediate, I think one of the panelists has made this point. You can mediate if both parties are agreeable to the role of the mediator and they feel that some purpose is served. I don't believe that is the case, because what we are talking about is an overture made by the United States.
Right.
We have no response from Iran to say that India is the preferred country
Right.
for this particular mediation. So that is a non-starter. I repeat my point that it would be in India's interest to be engaged and to be seen to be relevant to the global discourse on Iran in a manner that it would A, be effective, and B, it would further India's interests. So to that extent, I repeat what I said earlier, that the US overture should be seen in a positive manner, in a careful manner. Nobody is suggesting that India should plunge into something where the permanent members of the Security Council have not been able to arrive at any kind of consensus.
Right.
Our reason for being engaged is to say, in this part of the world, Iran is an important player. Iran represents many interests, and there is also a question of the principles that India stands for. So it is not as if India is going to mediate, again I repeat, for the US and for US interests. Far from it. The United States is quite capable of looking after its own interests.
Absolutely.
But because we have a robust bilateral relationship with the United States, we are looking for areas where we can enable certain, I would say, approaches, certain end results that would be in the larger regional good. I mean, nobody wants, everyone knows that if the balloon goes up on Iran, in the event of that particular military strike that has been spoken about so many times, I think we are all aware that it could lead to a very, very messy situation at a time when AFPAC is in the situation it is in,
Absolutely.
when Syria is simmering, and you then have something going on in Iran, it is going to adversely impact the whole region.
Absolutely.
And India will also be a critically affected country in the region. So these are all the exigencies. So to that extent, can we engage with the issue in a manner that we are effective and we advance or protect the Indian national interest? That
Okay.
is the framework in which I
Okay.
believe
Okay.
that India should make itself relevant.
Okay, Pramit,
Yeah.
you know what is happening in the Indian Foreign Office among the Indian government. Do they think that this is an opportunity which they should take up and try to persuade Iran, or do you think do you think they are quite wary of entering into this kind of an arrangement?
Well, I don't think Indian government has any problems with acting as a messenger. Ultimately, the question, well, there's a difference between a messenger and being a mediator.
Right.
Now, if you're just a messenger, that's relatively easy. You just basically ring up, call in the Iranian ambassador and tell him, or your ambassador in Tehran goes and meets somebody in the Iranian foreign ministry and says, look, this is what we've been told to pass on to you. Mediation, however, would require Iran to come in and say, we would like you to act in that role. That I don't think Iran is interested. I'm not too certain that the Americans are interested either. And in fact, I believe today Tehran has said that we are not interested even in bilateral talks with even the United States. They haven't mentioned about India. And we will continue to talk through the five nation talks that we already
5+1.
have right now. So that I don't think, so mediation I don't think is really in play right now. The point that I think that should be made, though, is I suspect the United States has probably asked a number of other countries which have decent relations with Iran or still have continue to talk to Iran to also pass on that same message. Rarely is it that a country like the US would ask only one country to play that role. They would probably ask several countries to do that as well. So I would suspect Iran has got that message on several fronts. Clearly there was some sort of footsie going on about the idea of the US and Iran talking directly to each other. From the New York Times article that some of you mentioned.
Both of them have denied that any such thing is happening, any secret talks are happening.
Well, I would point out that for the Americans, the problem with the New York Times article is it was printed just the day before the U.S. presidential debate
yeah.
on foreign policy. I think Obama, even if he was interested in such a bilateral talk, would be completely unwilling to have that come out or to talk about that in a presidential debate, because he knows that Romney will hit. One of the things that he will hit him on is that you're too soft on Iran
Right.
and too weak on the relationship with Israel.
Okay, Mr. Shashank. Now that this isn't it interesting that just towards the end, when the U.S. presidential election is on, and on November 4th that polling will take place, who will win? We're not sure. In this kind of a situation, should India just buy time and see what is going to be the results of the U.S. presidential election before even thinking of taking up this request?
For India, it is important that Iranian issue is not only being seen as a Middle Eastern issue affecting only Israel, but it affects other areas which we have been talking about, which means that that position has been appreciated in Washington, and they have tried to involve a country like India. Because they're talking to China, Russia.
No, one question. Do you think that situation would change? Let us say if Obama doesn't win and Romney comes into power, you think this situation will change and India's this request of US will no more be valid?
No, I don't think the American diplomacy works in that manner. So if they have decided to consult India, there are certain good reasons why they have conveyed
So
this request
it's
to
a
India.
bipartisan thing.
So that should be taken for that Romney is not going to reverse on that. If he reverses something which will be vis-a-vis Obama's position on Iran, not with regard to India.
Okay.
If at all, I feel that under Romney, the dialogue with India would be further strengthened. But the point is that here I see that Iran is now being fixed more and more in the context of South Asia and Southwest Asia.
Yes.
And which means that India's position, India's perception about this region gets much greater prominence than it was getting earlier. And I think in this context, we also have to see that China is now being met squarely by the Americans in Asia. And therefore, they have been thinking of other partners. So on some other side, they have the TPP. On this side, they are thinking of India as a useful partner. And they're trying to just consider this a probing exercise.
Okay, it's a probing exercise, but we will wait and watch how this will move forward. Anyway, tomorrow's debate, the US presidential debate, should also give us some idea of what the US is also thinking about. We will keep a close watch on all this. Thanks to all my guests, Uday Bhaskar, Pramit Chaudhuri, Mr. Shashank, and Prof.A.K.Pasha. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another issue on the big picture, same time tomorrow.